This is take 3, my reaction video to Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier 2. I had 2 previous videos, both problems with them. Regardless, I'm going to make this as concise as possible because that's all I care about now. I want to go to bed. First point, I called those leg kicks from Dustin Poirier even before DC did. Those were obviously going to be a problem. I mean, Dustin Poirier, in comparison to Conor, is obviously bigger, just on sight. And that's kind of been, Connor's always been slight of stature, a little thinner, a little shorter. He's an explosive, fighter, explosive athlete, knocks people out with that left hand, but that's always been a factor. When you're throwing leg kicks, they're leg kicks. They're going to hurt no matter who's throwing them. And it's Dustin Poirier, who has great leg kicks. I'm not sure necessarily Justin Gaethje level, but he has great leg kicks. And Connor's sleight of build and a leg kick is a leg kick. That was going to be a problem. He was not parrying, or excuse me, he was not checking any of them. By the second kick, if not the first, Kavanaugh should have jumped on that, and he should have known that that was going to be a problem. Frankly, Connor should have known that was going to be a problem. The fact that he neglected that led to the later stages of the fight in the beginning of the second round, where he couldn't move as well as he needed to, which I think partially led to him getting quartered and led to the final flurry in which he got knocked out. So they should have both recognized that as a problem. Not that I blame Kavanaugh; he's obviously a great coach. I've coached nobody in boxing, and if you're Connor's coach, you get a day off. Not you don't get a day off, but you can be forgiven for um, thinking your fighter's invincible and taking a back seat to actually coaching. You're watching the fight, taking a back seat to actually coaching. It's not it's not something I would blame him for. Second point, I got to be quicker. Second point, Conor looked different. I don't know what exactly it was about it. For whatever reason, I thought he was fighting more like a mixture of Conor and Figueiredo. Maybe it's just because I was watched his fight last. But yeah, Conor has this tendency to very gracefully just extend his arms and establish that range and occupy that space. Um, and he didn't really do that. His arms were more up here. He was throwing great strikes. He was throwing counter strikes, absolutely. But he didn't necessarily establish that range, and he seemed much more cautious. Not to say he looked nervous at all, but his stance would indicate that he looked more cautious. Didn't look more cautious in terms of the way his body movement, but I can give no other explanation. I don't know why he looked like that. Um, and it didn't seem to serve any purpose. He didn't throw the leg kicks. He usually threw the karate style when he was out, when he fought like this. Didn't throw any of those kicks. Didn't extend that hook kick, which honestly is a weapon, but also is used to establish distance and occupy distance as well. He just didn't do any of that. He did all of that with his hands. Did it beautifully with his hands. Did it well with his hands. He won the first round, in my opinion. So still great striking, but it wasn't the Conor that we usually see, and it was obviously not the Conor. I wonder how much of that was planned. I wonder how little of that was planned. I wonder how much the leg kicks eventually contributed to that being the strategy and why there was no change. Because Conor clearly felt the accumulation of kicks at the end of round one. Point three, which is just a commentary on the final flurry. Um, yeah, it's a great that final 8-10 seconds. It's a great showcase of both Poirier and Conor. Um, listen, Conor put himself in that situation, in my opinion, because of the legs. But once he was in that situation, did a great job of bobbing and weaving. Justin Poirier threw a killer left hook that rocked him, and Conor just couldn't run. Um, Partially, possibly because of the legs, so he just kind of had to bob and weave and did it well um, and dodged a lot of shots, missed a lot of damage, but he got caught again with another left hand that rocked him. He got caught once or twice before, but Poirier was throwing like 10, 12 shots. Got caught again, and then Poirier hit him with a just not hard necessarily, but on the way down almost hit him right on the nose, just perfectly. You can tell Conor felt it, and he got knocked out. Um, but good job in terms of avoiding it. In terms of Dustin Poirier striking, I mean, nothing. It's the thing is this is going to sound disrespectful, but nothing new. Nothing new at all. There was nothing. There was nothing shockingly different about his striking. It was just a typical Dustin Poirier flurry. It just so happened to knock out one of the greatest athletes at what featherweight, lightweight. What, no, that's not it. What have you, welterweight? I don't know. One of the greatest athletes in UFC history. But there was nothing different about the striking. It was the same old Dustin Poirier striking that took out Dan Hooker, that gave Conor problems the first time, that they gave Khabib problems as well. I mean, he's always been a championship fighter, and that leads directly into um, my fourth point. So I guess to end the third point, just say great striking, but it's not new. Um, he just implemented it correctly and was able to put Conor in a situation where his um, 10, 20 punch flurries could happen. Um, yeah, which leads into my next point, which is that, I mean, Dustin Poirier is obviously at this level. He's always, not always been, but I mean, he's been championship caliber for a while. He just hasn't gotten the respect for it. And I came into this fight. I didn't really care, frankly. I did care massively, but I wasn't gonna sit down and watch it tonight. If I didn't see it, it wasn't gonna kill me. I came into this just thinking Conor Mania. Now I'm shockingly, surprisingly, very excited about Dustin Poirier's reign. I want to see some promos for this kid. I want them to this kid. 22. I want him to shine. I want him to shine him up. He deserves to be shined up. I want them to make a champion out of this man in terms of the media, and I want him to have a reign. I hope he wins a lot of his upcoming fights. I hope he wins, for a while, because I'm happy to see this, and I hope Conor. I know Conor will handle this well, but I hope that he um, I guess there's nothing more to say. I just hope he has some sort of minor epiphany about what, I don't know. I just hope he comes back an individual um, that can fight under circumstances that are not necessarily his own. Who, even though you should always be determining the geography of a fight and when you engage in an exchange or a battle, what have you, you should always be determining that, and that's the key to winning. You should be able to be a type of fighter that can withstand a certain amount of damage, and whatever Conor has to do to either not put himself in that situation again or otherwise acclimate to it, he has to do it. And he has to recover from this loss. I hope he does that as well. I hope he comes back. He will come back. Um, and the last point, or the last 2 points. Um, Firstly, just to say, I'm going to try to be quick. It's already 7 minutes. Um, in terms of Conor, tell me if this might be considered a hot take. Tell me if this is foolish. I was thinking with the fact that in every in all of his career there's been one constant, save for 2 fights, the last 2 fights, and it's been that the media coming into a fight have always portrayed him as an invincible figure. You know what I mean? There was obviously Nate Diaz, but Nate Diaz and is Nate Diaz, and even after his loss, there was still that aura of invincibility, and he proved it the way he knocked down Nate Diaz in the first few rounds. Even if he did, you know, have to endure adversity later, he always going into every fight had this aura of invincibility that was manufactured to an extent. Obviously, he's still Conor, but it was propped up and buttressed by this UFC system, by this UFC propaganda system, which wants your money and wants to hype up every fight and has every reason to call this fighter, you know, an invincible fighter, shocking fighter, a must-see fighter. And when that lined up with a young Conor and his mentality of I'm just gonna run through all these guys and they're in no way, shape, or form comparable to me, um, that was great. There was a consistency between the UFC propaganda and what Conor believed in his own head. But in his last 2 fights, that was not the case. Um, Perhaps that undermines my point that he won the Donald Cerrone fight so spectacularly. But is it absurd to say that might have, to a certain degree, played in to how he thought, which is extremely important? Um, is it absurd to say that that factored into how he thought, that him going through the adversity of an Nate Diaz and the humbling of the defeat from Khabib? Is it absurd to think that having gone through that, having experienced all that, he's still the same old self-confident Conor, still is obviously one of the most mentally stable individuals in the UFC, on the planet? He's a very stable individual, but is it absurd to say that discontinuity, that UFC saying, still UFC shocking, still UFC, Still shocking. Knockout fighter, invincible. Obviously not saying that outright, but implying that, and they're releasing science videos where they make him seem like a freak of nature to an extent. Is it shocking to think that him sitting down, knowing he's human, that discontinuity, that knowing that that's not the case, knowing that that's a lie, him even knowing, thinking perhaps he's the greatest fighter in the world, knowing that he doesn't match up to the hype, and that discontinuity for the first time in his career, one of the only times, save for the Cerrone fight, is it insane to think that that had an effect? I don't think so. I think that did have an effect to some extent. And furthermore, and this is the last point, over 10 minutes, um, got to give credit to Chael Sonnen uh, for introducing um, me to the idea, the concept. He said in a video, you don't want to be careless in a fight, but you do want to care less. Um, and that was an important thing to keep in mind, and that Conor cared less than Poirier cared. And I think that's a very good point. I think in a lot of cases that would have applied. I think to care less. When you think about stress, if you care more, if the stakes are higher, that's more stress. With more stress, depending on the situation, that can bring out more determination. So you can make it so stakes being higher can make an athlete or a fighter, an athlete really in any sport under any circumstances perform better. But it's indisputably the case that higher stakes mean higher stress, and the higher stress alone is not good. The higher stress alone is to be avoided. So in any fight, generally speaking, it would be the case that the fighter that cares less, like Chael said, you don't want to be careless in a fight, but you do want to care less. The fighter that care less would have the edge. In this case, the same logic applies, but the situation is not the same, and the situation is not the same, in my opinion, because Conor wanted to lose. No, because I think Conor had an abundance of respect for Dustin Poirier. And I think it is the case that no matter what happens, Conor just lost this. If Conor loses every fight for the rest of his UFC career and he has 10 more fights, his legacy is assured. It doesn't change anything. There are highlights that this man has made that will be shown for as long as the UFC exists and beyond that. Um, so he knows his legacy is not in jeopardy if he loses this fight, which can take some weight off of one's shoulders. But when you're facing a person who you respect, um, and when I say respect, I mean in terms of punching, he got hit by him hard in the first shot, and he didn't wobble. Dustin Poirier wobbled, but he got hit, and he knew it. And there were other strikes that Conor had to move away from in a way that frankly differentiated himself, Dustin Poirier, from the opposition. And Conor knew that. Respects the man's striking, respects the man's heart, knows he is a champion, just hasn't been crowned champion. He's championship caliber. Um, and that knowing that it won't matter if he loses, we're still going to be talking about him a year from now. Like Chael said, that's not necessarily the case with Dustin Poirier. Knowing that they're still going to be talking about him, um, did that take a certain amount of care away from Conor McGregor to such an extent that he was fine on some level with the concept of losing in a way that he wasn't in many of his previous fights? I think that is a possibility. In fact, I think the logic is incredibly sound in terms of the way Chael outlined it when he said, that quote about, wanting to care less. But I think in this case, it is a fact that Conor McGregor's a showman. He knows there's nothing going to happen to his future. He's going to be fine. And that all that being the case, subconsciously, he was all right with the loss, I think. Not that he went out and tried to lose, not that he wasn't trying to take his head off every second, every moment of that fight, but it's like, how do I not know his name? It's not Castellamato. Um, this is sacrilege. Um, Mike Tyson, they had a feud that was unsettled. He's an incredible coach. I forget his name, but I forget the exact quote, but essentially that 70% of boxing is mental. And I think similar percentages apply to the UFC. And I think that while he did care less, I think in this case, him caring less about himself and his legacy was dwarfed by the extent to which he cared that Dustin Poirier get a certain level of respect. Not dwarfed, excuse me, let me take that back, but it was sizable enough so that they were comparable. And on some level, subconsciously, I think he was okay with losing. He's lost before. He lost in 8 Diaz. It only added to his character and to his legacy. Lost to Khabib, that was crushing. No silver lining there, no obvious silver lining there. But he came out of the other, beat Donald Cerrone, came out the other side a fighter, still same old Conor. I think it is certainly a possibility that he was okay with an L, and he was more than fine with Dustin Poirier having that strap around him. Not that he planned to lose, obviously, but that somewhere subconsciously it factored in. Which something I haven't said in any of my previous videos because I was talking about how excited I was about Dustin Poirier's reign, assuming he has a one that can really be considered a reign. This just makes the Conor story all the more interesting. Listen, there are two items of discussion, typically that people will bring up with regards to Conor. His inability to last down the stretch, to gas out, or otherwise to not take damage, as one sort of point, and Conor McGregor losing his mojo, so to speak. Conor McGregor leaving his prime. Two things, those two things need to be discarded immediately. Not that Conor will never lose his prime, but that there is no setback. You're not going to crush Conor's mentality, rather. Conor's mentality, is second to none. And if you think he's going to take a loss and just be a totally different fighter, it's never going to be a Conor McGregor trait. We can stop talking about that now. But we can also stop talking about the nature, the character of Conor McGregor as a fighter. He can't take as much damage. He doesn't have as much gas, and that's just a fact. He can change his physique to try to compensate for that, but that will change his striking by definition. So does he want to, or does he just want to refine his style and make it into either his old style, because he did have a different style tonight, or does he want to, actually change something and make the jump to change his style entirely? I don't know, but he shouldn't fight the way he fought tonight. And I'm tired. I hope you got something from this. Goodbye.